Robin Williams dropped the microphone. Silence. The audience held its breath, but no one knew that this moment reached back 40 years. The Apollo Theater, New York City, October 1998. 2,000 people packed into velvet seats, expecting what they always got from Robin Williams: rapid-fire impressions, manic energy, laughter that made your ribs hurt. The stage lights were warm, golden, washing over him as he paced back and forth, building momentum for another bit about politicians and penguins. Then a young stagehand appeared from the wings. He shouldn't have been there. Not during the show. Not while Robin was mid-sentence. The audience noticed first, a ripple of confusion moving through the crowd like wind through wheat. Robin stopped talking. His hands, always moving, always gesturing, froze mid-air. The stagehand held out a white envelope. Nothing else. No explanation. Just that envelope, slightly worn at the edges, with Robin's name written in careful, trembling handwriting across the front. Robin took it. His face changed. Not the theatrical change he did for laughs, but something deeper. Something real. The mask he wore, the one that protected him, that kept the world at arm's length, began to crack. But what was written inside that envelope would bring Robin Williams to his knees, in front of 2,000 strangers, and force him to face the ghost of a promise he made when he was just 8 years old. If you want to witness the most emotionally raw moment of Robin Williams' life, subscribe now, because what happens next will break your heart, and rebuild it in ways you never expected. The year was 1959. Robin Williams was 8 years old, living in a big empty house in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. His father worked constantly. His mother was elegant, distant, occupied with charity events and social obligations. Robin spent most of his time alone, in rooms too large for a child, with only his imagination to keep him company. And Jonathan Winters. Not in person. Through a small transistor radio Robin kept under his pillow. Every night, after the house went dark and silent, Robin would turn the dial until he found Jonathan Winters' voice. That voice. Wild, unpredictable, transforming into characters that didn't exist 5 seconds before. A farmer. A astronaut. A crying baby. A fighter pilot. All of them real, all of them alive, all of them exploding from one man's mind. Robin would lie there in the dark, listening, laughing silently into his pillow so no one would hear. But it wasn't just the comedy. It was something else. Something Jonathan Winters did that no one else could do. He made loneliness disappear. For those 30 minutes, Robin wasn't alone anymore. He was inside Jonathan's imagination, running wild through worlds that existed only in sound and laughter. One night, after a particularly brilliant bit where Jonathan played 17 different people at a bus stop, 8-year-old Robin made a promise to the darkness of his room. "One day, I'll make people feel the way he makes me feel. I'll give them what he gave me." He didn't know then that Jonathan Winters would never hear that promise. Or that 40 years later he would. Fast forward to 1998. Robin Williams was no longer that lonely kid in Michigan. He was a phenomenon. Mrs. Doubtfire. Good Will Hunting. Dead Poets Society. He'd won an Oscar. He'd made millions laugh. He'd become, in many ways, the successor to Jonathan Winters, the same manic energy, the same rapid-fire transformations, the same ability to turn pain into comedy and comedy into medicine. But he'd never told Jonathan Winters the truth. Never told him about those nights under the covers, about the loneliness that Jonathan's voice had cured, about the promise made in the dark. There had been opportunities. They'd met at comedy clubs, crossed paths at award shows. They'd even performed together once, a benefit in Los Angeles where they traded impressions like boxers trading jabs. Jonathan had been kind, gracious, complimentary. But Robin never found the words. How do you tell someone they saved your childhood? How do you explain that a voice on the radio was more of a parent than your actual parents? So he never said it. And as the years passed, that silence became a weight. Not crushing, but constant. A small regret that lived in the back of his mind, especially late at night when the performances were over and the laughter had faded and he was alone again, just like he'd been at 8 years old. And then came that envelope. Robin stood on the Apollo stage, holding that worn white envelope, and the audience didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent. Comedy shows don't have moments like this. The script doesn't call for a stagehand to interrupt. The energy doesn't drop to zero and hang there, suspended, waiting. Robin's hands were shaking. Barely noticeable, but there. He looked at the envelope, then at the audience, then back at the envelope. His mouth opened as if to make a joke, to deflect, to transform this awkward moment into something funny. But nothing came out. Finally, he opened it. His fingers fumbled with the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and a photograph. Robin pulled out the photograph first. Black and white, creased with age. A young man in the 1950s, sitting at a radio microphone, grinning at the camera like he had a secret. Jonathan Winters, maybe 25 years old, at the beginning of everything. Robin stared at it. His breathing changed. The audience could see his chest rise and fall, could see him blinking rapidly, trying to hold something back. Then he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, not the handwriting of a young man, but of someone older, someone whose hands no longer obeyed the way they once did. Robin began to read silently. His lips moved slightly. Then stopped. Then moved again. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The silence in the Apollo Theater was absolute. No coughs. No rustling. 2,000 people watching one man read a letter, and somehow understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. Robin looked up. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but right on the edge. He held up the letter, as if the audience could read it from their seats, as if showing it to them would explain everything. "This is from Jonathan Winters," he said. His voice cracked on the name. "This is from my hero." Someone in the third row gasped. A woman in the balcony brought her hand to her mouth. Robin looked back down at the letter, and this time, he read it aloud. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but in that silence, every word carried. "Dear Robin, I heard something recently that I need to tell you about. A mutual friend told me that when you were a boy, you used to listen to my radio show. That you kept a transistor radio under your pillow. That I helped you through some lonely nights." Robin paused. Swallowed hard. Continued. "I want you to know that for 40 years, I've been listening to you. Watching you. And you've helped me through lonely nights too. More than you know. What you do, the way you give yourself completely to make others feel less alone, that's not just comedy. That's a kind of love. And I want you to know that I see it. I've always seen it." Robin stopped reading. He couldn't continue. The words were still there on the page, but his voice had left him. He stood there, holding that letter, and the dam broke. Tears ran down his face. Not the pretty kind you see in movies, but real tears, the kind that come from a place you've been protecting for 40 years. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people stood up. Then more. Then everyone. A standing ovation for a man who wasn't performing, who wasn't saying anything, who was just standing there crying while holding a letter from his childhood hero. Robin looked out at them through his tears and did something he rarely did. He spoke without hiding behind a character, without a joke, without deflection. "When I was 8 years old," he said, his voice thick, "I was alone. Really alone. And his voice, Jonathan's voice, it was the only thing that made me feel like maybe I wasn't broken. Like maybe my imagination, all this chaos in my head, maybe it was a gift instead of a curse." He held up the letter again. "And now he's telling me that I did the same thing for him. That I gave back what he gave me." Robin wiped his face with the back of his hand. "How do you say thank you for something like that? How do you?" He couldn't finish. He just stood there, looking at that letter, at that photograph of young Jonathan Winters, and for the first time in decades, Robin Williams wasn't performing. He was just being human. Completely, vulnerably, beautifully human. Subscribe and leave a comment. because the most powerful moment of Robin's life is still ahead, and what happened next changed everything he thought he knew about his own purpose. Backstage, after the show, Robin sat alone in his dressing room. The letter was spread out on the table in front of him. He'd read it 17 times. The last paragraph, the one he hadn't read aloud to the audience, said this: "Robin, I'm getting old. My hands shake. My memory isn't what it was. But I need you to know something before I can't say it anymore. You didn't just learn from me. You became something I never could be. You took what I started and you made it bigger, kinder, more generous. You made it into medicine. And that 8-year-old boy who listened to me in the dark? He grew up to save thousands of 8-year-old boys just like him. That's not just success, Robin. That's legacy. That's love. Don't ever forget that." Robin traced his finger over Jonathan's signature. The handwriting was so shaky it was barely legible, but it was there. Proof. Validation. Permission to believe that maybe, just maybe, all of this meant something. There was a knock on the door. His manager poked his head in. "Robin? They want to know if you're okay. The audience is still out there. Some of them are waiting too. Tell them I'll be out in a minute," Robin said quietly. "Are you sure? You don't have to. I want to." 20 minutes later, Robin walked back onto the stage. Most of the audience had left, but about 200 people remained, sitting in scattered groups throughout the theater. When they saw him, they started to applaud, but Robin held up his hand. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. They went quiet. "For most of my life, I thought the reason I did this, the comedy, the characters, all of it, was because I needed attention. Because I was desperate to be seen. And maybe that was true at first. But tonight, reading that letter, I realized something." He paused, looking out at those 200 faces looking back at him. "I do this because I was that lonely kid. And I know there are millions of lonely kids out there right now, lying in their beds, feeling like they don't fit, like they're too much or not enough or just wrong somehow. And if I can reach even one of them, if I can make them feel less alone for even 5 minutes, then everything, all the exhaustion, all the pressure, all the darkness, it's worth it." A young woman in the front row was crying. Robin saw her, stepped down off the stage, and walked over to her. He knelt down in front of her seat. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm that kid," she whispered. "I'm still that kid." Robin took her hand. "Me too," he said. "Every single day." He stayed there for a moment, just holding this stranger's hand, and in that gesture was everything the letter had said: legacy, love, the gift of making someone feel less alone. What Robin Williams didn't know that night was that this moment, this letter, this recognition from his hero, would become the anchor that held him during his darkest hours. When depression came. When the diagnosis came. When everything felt impossible, he would remember Jonathan Winter's words. "That's not just success. That's legacy. That's love." Years later, after Robin's death, Jonathan Winter's family found something among his belongings, a worn VHS tape, labeled in Jonathan's handwriting. It was a recording of Robin's HBO special from 1986. Jonathan had watched it so many times the tape was starting to degrade. In the margins of the case, he'd written notes. "Perfect timing here. Watch how he holds the audience. He's better than I ever was." And at the bottom, in larger letters, underlined twice, "This boy is my legacy." The letter Robin received that night in 1998 wasn't just fan mail. It wasn't just validation. It was a torch being passed, one lonely kid to another, across 40 years and a million nights of making strangers feel less alone. Robin kept that letter with him for the rest of his life. It traveled in his suitcase to every show, every movie set, every late-night appearance. When he felt like he wasn't enough, when the darkness crept in, he would take it out and read Jonathan's words again. "You became something I never could be." And in those moments, Robin Williams, the man who gave everything to make others laugh, who carried more pain than most people could imagine, would remember that 8-year-old boy with a radio under his pillow. The boy who made a promise in the dark. The boy who kept it. The Apollo Theater moment became legend. People who were there that night told the story for years afterward, always with the same reverence, the same quiet awe. "I saw Robin Williams cry," they would say. "Really cry. And it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Because it wasn't about comedy that night. It wasn't about performance or entertainment, or any of the things we usually associate with Robin Williams. It was about recognition. About a lonely kid finally hearing that he'd done exactly what he set out to do. That he'd taken his pain and transformed it into something that healed others. That night, Robin Williams learned what Jonathan Winters had known all along: the deepest comedy comes from the deepest loneliness. And when you transform that loneliness into something that makes others feel less alone, you create something that never dies. A promise made in the dark. Kept for 40 years. Acknowledged by the one person who mattered most. That's not just a career. That's not just success. That's love. Share and subscribe, so his story will never be forgotten.